The classroom smelled of sun-warmed crayons and chamomile. Tiny chairs circled a rug the color of late summer. A window threw a strip of golden light across a paper moth someone had glued with sticky earnestness. Lily folded another paper boat with quiet patience, while Mason stacked blocks into a lopsided tower nearby. Emma, who was 5 and already practiced in the polite tyranny of scheming, leaned close to Lily's ear and whispered an arrangement with the solemnity of a conspirator. "You must meet Mr. Blake. He has a boat like that in a big room. My daddy says he'll bring cupcakes." If you enjoy stories of quiet, careful love, of unexpected connections that mend more than one life, stay with this one until the end. If this finds you on a quiet afternoon, subscribe and like to follow more tales about people who make home again, and share it with someone who needs a soft, hopeful story. Emma's invitation began as mischief and ended, inevitably, in something like destiny. Ethan Blake had a way of moving through rooms as if he belonged to their shadows, measured, almost apologetic in his stillness. He owned a company that made headlines and a study full of low light and old photographs. He also owned, unshakably, the memory of Grace, her handwriting on the backs of receipts, a chipped teacup in the back of a cupboard, the half of a photograph kept in a locket. He had learned to live with halves, half sentences, half laughter, whole grief folded into the smallest of rituals. When Emma announced the blind date at breakfast, she did it with the calm conviction of a general issuing orders. Ethan looked up from his newspaper and found himself smiling because 5-year-old certainty is an effective kindness. He agreed, mostly because he trusted Emma's happiness as a compass. She wanted cupcakes and company, and he had learned from the slow, sudden business of living that letting the small person lead sometimes rearranged the rest of the room into something bearable. Lily arrived with a raincoat slung over her arm, though the air had dried to a warm glow by the school gate. She had that particular kind of tidy resilience parents mistook for composure. A braid that kept time with her hands, an apron dusted with flour from a morning craft, and a laugh that folded easily into the noise of children. Mason clung to her hip and inspected Ethan with the frank appraisal only small boys possess. "You have a boat?" he asked solemnly. Ethan crouched to meet the gravity of Mason's gaze. "Not a boat on the water," he said, "but a big model in my office. Maybe someday you can see it." He reached out on impulse and ruffled the boy's hair. The touch was as small and as shaky as a prayer. They met at a cafe that smelled of toasted bread and dark coffee. Emma, of course, made sure there were cupcakes. Conversation shuffled along the surface. Work, school, weather. And then, in an unmoored minute between sips, something unnamed loosened. Ethan watched Lily speak about teaching with the kind of absorption that makes a person luminous. Her hands sketched stories he could feel the edges of. He noticed, too, a tiny birthmark near her collarbone, the same familiar crescent he'd traced on the sleeping cheek of his wife on a summer night years ago. His throat tightened as if at the sudden hint of a beloved song. It was a resemblance, more than that, a precise echo. Not only the shape of the mouth or the tilt of the head, but a way the light caught them both, as if some small law of inheritance had been waiting in the air to announce itself. The moment was a pull on a thread Ethan had not known was loose, and he found himself asking distraction after distraction until the conversation returned to safer shores. Lily noticed the way he watched and diverted with a smile that was both gentle and wary. She had learned to expect attention. Orphanages teach children a careful eye. She had, too, the private habit of keeping one hand tucked into her apron pocket, as if to assure herself the torn photograph she almost never showed was still there. When she did think of those jagged edges, she would smooth the paper, as if by repetition she could make the past whole. After the cafe, the world rearranged itself like the careful shifting of chairs. Ethan went home with a quiet unsettledness lodged under his sternum. At night, he opened the cedar box where he kept Grace's things. There was a sweater smelling faintly of lavender, a stack of old postcards, the locket he'd found at the roadside the week after the funeral, and the other half of a photograph. The image was small and faded at the crease. Two girls shoulder to shoulder, their hair the same dark, thick braid that seemed to have passed down like a family heirloom. The face left in the locket was Grace's in profile, the other half torn clean from the paper, as if some hand had chosen separation instead of leaving the two together. Ethan traced the jagged edge with a fingertip, feeling the tiny raggedness like an accusation. He remembered Grace's handwriting across the top of a scrap of paper. "For when you forget me," she'd written, in a joke that had tasted then of ordinary domestic immortality. He had not been the kind of man to misplace grief. He had kept it precise and measured until now. When he returned to the preschool the next week, under the pretense of dropping off cupcakes and checking on Emma's plans, he found Lily in the story corner, reading aloud with slow, luminous emphasis. Her voice mellowed each sentence until children leaned in. Even the janitor paused with his mop to listen. Ethan watched and felt the strange, vertiginous ease of someone discovering a missing piece of an old puzzle where they had quietly assumed the piece would never be found. He began an investigation the way some men with grief begin chores, carefully, with lists, with a necessary practicalness that steadied the trimmer underneath. Martin Walsh, a family physician who had become something between friend and archivist over the years, agreed to help Ethan look up the small records he could access. Martin had been careful with Grace's file, professional, then quieter, as if the facts themselves needed layers of gentleness. He found a name among the old adoption papers, St. Jude's Home for Children, a place that had closed and been rolled into the bigger municipal services after the decade's budget cuts. There were, however, paper trails, a folded intake form, a child's record with a neat pencil inscription, "Twin noted," and a faded stamp that matched the shape on the back of the photograph. The notation was as simple as it was devastating. One child listed as Grace L., and an adjacent entry scratched out and annotated only with a sudden first name, Lillian, and then a year of departure with no forwarding address. Ethan held the photocopy in the dim of his study and found that grief had new shapes. Curiosity could be a way of loving back into someone. He did not tell himself, at first, that he was seeking a substitute. He told himself he was looking for truth, for the map Grace had never finished drawing. But the map, like any honest map, began to show borders where loyalties and sudden tenderness might meet. Lily, for her part, was wary of invitations into other people's private rooms. She had rehearsed boundaries in the nights when Mason finally slept and the apartment settled into the hush that comes after making dinner alone. The torn photograph in her apron pocket had been with her since she could remember. It was the only proof that once, somewhere, her image had been matched to someone else's face. She had always thought the separation was ordinary cruelty, a bureaucratic slip that had become fate. To imagine someone, a man, with a study full of dim light and pictures, sifting through her past felt at first like an exposure she could not grant. Yet there were small bridges. Emma, with the blunt strategies common to those who love without suspicion, began keeping two sets of art for show and tell, one labeled Daddy's Work and another labeled Miss Lily's Class. She invited them both to the same park and arranged that Mason should always somehow be the one to fetch the ball when Ethan and Lily's hands brushed. Their evenings started to knuckle into a rhythm, a shared coffee here, a text asking about a school concert there, the exchange of recipes for lemon cake. The relationship between Ethan and Lily crawled forward with the shy dignity of two animals learning to share a small warm spot. The photograph, though, did not rest. It gnawed at corners with the kind of persistent insistence that made explanations unsatisfying. Ethan began to keep his eyes on small things. The locket Lily wore at times, a silver crescent that matched the indentation on the half photo he'd kept. The way Lily hummed when she arranged crayons in rainbow order. the habit of turning a page in a notebook twice before writing, a tic Grace had had and Ethan had once called trivial and loved all the same. When Ethan finally asked Lily about the locket, she brushed a lock of hair behind her ear and told him the story she'd told 1,000 times, the story children learn to tell with the smoothness of practice. She had been in an orphanage, she said. She had been handed half a photograph and asked to remember. Sometimes she would unpack the memory, with trust. My twin, she'd say, the phrase a petal fragile and sure. And sometimes she would shut it away as one shuts a window against unseasonable rain. She had never looked for the other half because looking felt like exposing the wound. Yet hearing Ethan ask made something tilt. He did not press. He did not, at first, tell her he kept Grace's other half in a cedar box. The proof, in the end, fell into place with a quietness that was almost ordinary. Martin arranged a consultation with a small private lab. Lily agreed, because after months of the small closeness between them, she felt the rightness of having an answer. They did a cheek swab in a small sterile room smelling faintly of antiseptic and lemon. Mason, who had trailed along out of a child's devotion to being in the big people's plan, watched from the doorway with the kind of solemnity adults forget how to keep. There were practicalities, consent forms, a waiting period measured in business days, an envelope that would be mailed to the address Ethan had given and then delivered by hand, because addresses carry their own peculiar intimacy. The lab's report would read as clinical fact, probabilities, markers, percentages. It would do its work and leave the rest, the human sorting of love and loyalty, to them. Ethan's days after the swab blurred into a careful watchfulness. He would find small excuses to cross the preschool parking lot, to pick up an extra muffin, to ask about Mason's scraped knee. The calendar on his phone filled with benign things, board meetings, charity dinners, dentist appointments. None of them felt necessary in the way that waiting for a single envelope became. At night he would take out the locket, compare the jagged edge to the half photo he kept, hold them toward each other as if light itself could confirm what his mind suspected. Where the paper met, the edges fit like the first slow pieces of a puzzle. The day the envelope arrived, rain started soft on the city, a spring rain that smelled of new leaves and pavement warmed by the sudden sun. Ethan heard the knock and felt his heart move like someone running a hand across a piano, slow, tentative, then accelerating. He opened the door to find the courier holding a plain official envelope. For a brief second, the paper seemed heavier than it had any right to be. He went to his study and made chamomile tea, the ritual of calming hands and a small domestic cadence that had once been shared and could be, perhaps, shared again. He sat at the desk, the lamplight throwing a pool of gold across the wood. The envelope lay on the desk as if it had been waiting for him, its flap unassuming. Mason, who had learned where the good biscuits were kept, padded in and perched on the arm of the chair. Emma hovered in the doorway, a small witness. Ethan slit the envelope with care. He unfolded the single sheet inside and read numbers at first, markers, probabilities, technical phrasing. Then he let his eyes find the phrase that mattered. Genetic relationship confirmed. Probability 99.98%. For a long moment, he could do nothing but look at the words as if they were a sunrise he hadn't known he needed. The confirmation felt like both an answer and a summons. It promised belonging that had once been lost and insisted upon new responsibilities and new tenderness. For Ethan, there was a rush of loss for the clarity such proof brought. It made his grief more complicated, more entwined with a future he had not imagined. For Lily, if she had been in the next room, which she was not, such a number would be both relief and a new kind of exposure, proof laid bare in black and white. Ethan sat with the letter and the silence pressing close. He thought about Grace's laugh and the way she had set a teapot on the table without looking, as if certain small rituals would prevent the world from sliding. He thought about the half photograph and about the girl who had taught his child's class to fold paper boats. He rose, moved through the house that had been full of two halves for too long, and went to the little corridor outside the preschool where Lily would be putting on her raincoat. He found her there, looking out at the thinning drizzle, hair slightly damp, a small smile that was the supremely generous shape of someone who had decided not to be overwhelmed by the world's heavy questions. For a moment they stood without speaking. Mason tugged at Ethan's jacket and asked, very plainly, whether this meant Lily was his sister. Ethan knelt and looked up at his daughter. Yes, he said, the word arriving like a stone thrown into calm water. The ripples felt endless. Lily's face changed in a way that made Ethan see history move across a human face. The shudder of surprise, then the blank, then the slow gathering of a different expression, a kind of careful hope. She put a hand to her mouth, then to the pocket where the torn photograph rested like a small secret. She had lived with possibility as a companion for years. Confirmation arrived now with the bluntness of a delivered fact. They did not speak for a long time. The rain thinned to a soft mist that left the air smelling like the inside of a kettle. Children came and went, clapping and carrying backpacks. Life performed its ordinary mercy. When they finally talked, it was in fragments. Questions, clarifications, sentences that made room for the immensity of what they'd discovered. "How could this happen?" Lily asked at one point, not accusing, but trying to fold a complicated reality into language she could hold. Ethan told her what he knew. An adoption long ago, a separation that might have been paperwork and circumstance and luck. He told her about the photograph, half he had kept, and the locket he'd found, and how sometimes memory keeps raw things as if bracing for loss. He told her that he had loved Grace in a way that had never allowed for bargaining, and that the discovery didn't lessen that love. Rather, it layered him with a new kind of debt, to truth, to care, to the living. Lily listened, and then, as if finishing a stitch she had started alone for years, reached into her apron and produced the torn half of the photograph. When Ethan saw the jagged line meet his own piece, the small click the paper made was nearly audible. It was, in its way, a sound of reconciliation. There were practical conversations to follow. How to introduce such a truth to the children, what names and roles would feel honest, whether the word sister belonged to shadow or substance. They agreed on small things first. They would tell Emma the truth in a way she could carry. They would let Mason ask questions without being rushed, and they would not, under any circumstances, let the children feel like experiments. For Ethan, the hardest part came after the verification had settled into reality, the negotiation of loyalty. He loved Grace as he had loved the air, necessary and daily and beyond explanation. Loving Lily would not be the replacement. Loving her might instead be a form of honoring the life Grace had been and the life she could no longer live. He found himself, in the quiet hours, speaking aloud to the empty house. "I will not forget you," he told the photograph. The words felt both inadequate and necessary. Lily, meanwhile, let herself feel a cautious kind of belonging she had guarded against her whole life. She slept with the torn photograph inside her bedside tin box, and, for the first time in years, allowed herself to think of the future as a place where the name home might apply to more than one address. She taught her children, as she always had, to notice the small mercies, a cup of tea for a cold throat, a story read aloud regardless of the hour. When they told Emma, they did so with the simplicity children deserve. Ethan crouched down to her level and showed her the two halves of the photograph pressed together. Emma's face registered the logic of images with an almost holy certainty. "So she is like Auntie Grace," Emma said, and then, with the simple, unbothered kindness of a child, "that means she is family too." The days that followed were a cautious choreography. People asked questions with the freckled politeness of those who mean no harm. Some asked too many questions and had to be gently redirected. Ethan's friends offered support in the ways men often find available,
meals delivered, quiet offers to help with schedules. Martin advised on paperwork and the little formalities that must be attended to when lives are reknit. The city, as always, continued. Traffic jams occurred, bills arrived, the seasons moved without consulting anyone. Yet, beneath the practical, there was a more tender reconstruction. Meals began to be shared more often. Mason left small hand-drawn maps of the routes from school to the bakery where they met on weekends. Lily taught Emma how to braid hair without twitching, and Ethan learned, half awkwardly, how to make pancakes that weren't quite perfect but were made with a patient heart. One afternoon, months after the envelope had been opened and the word "sister" had settled into use, the sky let fall a sudden rain that pushed people indoors and made the city smell like distant gardens. Ethan and Lily sat at the kitchen table with a pot of chamomile between them, steam curling like a tentative question. They watched Mason and Emma conspire over a board game and felt the odd, steady comfort of shared domestic sounds. The click of a spoon, a child laughing at a move, the kettle's faint whistle. "Do you ever feel like we're doing something dangerous?" Lily asked, not dramatizing, but naming the small, honest fear. "Like we're stepping into a life that will never be neat again?" Ethan looked at her and considered how grief taught him the measure of caution, and how love taught him the measure of risk. "I feel afraid," he said, "and I also feel hopeful. Maybe they can be true at the same time?" She smiled at that, a small, private curve. He reached across the table and lightly took her hand. It was an unposed gesture, the kind that might grow into 100 others. There remained decisions to make that would not be rushed, terms of guardianship if legalities called for it, the careful naming of roles in holiday cards, the mapping of visits to children's therapists for gentle support. But the immediate weather of them, golden mornings, quiet afternoon teas, the children learning each other's small rhythms, gave proof that belonging is often built of tiny acts rather than announcements. Even so, the discovery had transformed Ethan more than he expected. He found himself going through Grace's things less for the sake of memory and more to leave room for the present. He started a new album in the study, a modest thing where he pasted new photographs beside old ones, where a child's drawing might live next to a postcard Grace had loved. The torn photograph, once a symbol of pain, became a hinge. It showed where a rift had been and how the two edges, with care, could be brought back together.
There was one moment, late in the year, rain on the windows, the house smelling of lemon cake, that felt like a small coronation. Mason had drawn a picture of 3 stick figures under a house, and Emma had written beneath in her earnest scrawl, "Family." They taped the drawing to the fridge with a magnet that had lost its paint. Ethan stood at the sink, washing a plate, and watched the magnet hold the picture steady. He thought of Grace, and the ache in his chest was as present as ever. He thought, too, of the way Lily had laughed the first time Mason knocked over her carefully built block tower, and then rebuilt it again with him. He understood, with a slow and certain peace, that love could be expanded, and that loyalty need not be a closed gate. The rain stopped, and the light after felt clean, as if the city had been rinsed. Outside, a small boy ran after a paper boat in a gutter, and called for it with the unprocessed joy that belongs to that age. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked on, and the warmth of chamomile and lemon lingered. They had, through a series of small nights and decisive tests, formed something neither of them had dared name in public. An unconventional family that carried grief as part of its furniture, but did not let grief furnish the whole house. There would be awkward introductions and moments of doubt, and the complicated work of deciding how to commemorate 2 lives at once. But there was also the ordinary miracle of matching laundry, of evening stories, and the way a child's hand fits into a larger one. Ethan slid a new photograph into the album that night. Lily with Mason, both laughing at something off camera, the light catching their hair in a halo of gold. He closed the album and set it aside with the kind of serenity that is small and hard-won. And somewhere, in a pocket lined with 1,000 small memories, lay a torn photograph, whose edges no longer felt like accusation, but rather like an invitation to stitch. They had found each other, in the most modern and stubborn of ways, through DNA, through serendipity, and through children's mischief. And we're beginning, slowly, to answer the question of what belonging can be. The city, indifferent and benevolent, continued to move. They, in their corner of it, learned to make tea for three, and to say Grace's name aloud without fearing that remembrance would erase what was still possible. The work of healing, they discovered, was less a dramatic event than 100 small acts of showing up. Perpendicular afternoons of story, extra muffins cut into small hands, late-night talks that unspooled into plans for holidays where memories could sit beside new traditions. Rain came again after that night, gentle as a withheld confession. Ethan woke to the sound on the roof and found Lily in the kitchen, hands cupped around a steaming cup. Mason slept on a small couch after a day of decisive play. Emma had drawn another picture and stuck it up next to the old one. He moved quiet as a thought and took the cup from Lily's hands, warming his palms. "No grand gestures," Lily teased softly. "Just quiet days with chamomile." "Just," Ethan agreed. He let the word hang like a promise that needn't be spoken loudly to be true. Outside, the rain made the world smell clean and new, and inside, a house that would never again be only two halves, they sat and drank and planned small routes toward a future that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a place they could all live in together. The torn photograph lay in the tin box on the shelf, its edges joined now by glue and patience, its image whole in the way that matters. Two faces, side by side, both smiling. They had found one another in the most ordinary manner, by chance and by proof, and by the oddest insistence of children's plans. And they would learn, gradually and without spectacle, to live as a family, stitched from what had been lost and what they had chosen to keep. Spring arrived in unhurried increments, pale and patient. The house grew lighter by degrees. Curtains washed, a cracked windowsill repainted, a potted rosemary pushed into a corner that caught the morning. Mason learned to tie his own shoelaces in 2 long sessions of patience that felt heroic to Emma. She taped a certificate she had made, Mason, Shoelace Champion, to the fridge beside the stick-figure family. Small trophies multiplied, not to mark perfection, but to mark the habit of trying. They spoke of Grace with a new ease. It did not come all at once. Often it began with a question. What would Grace have put on this cake? Or with a picture Emma sketched of a woman with a loose braid, laughing. Ethan found himself answering with a memory rather than a silence, and the memory unfurled like a ribbon. The sound of Grace mixing batter with exaggerated care, the lopsided way she arranged sprinkles by color, the shy, private smile that arrived when she read something aloud that made her especially pleased. Naming those details made them less like relics and more like tools they could use to make ordinary days kinder. They chose a Saturday in late May to do what felt like the first official thing, a small ceremony at the Riverside Park where Grace had taken the children on summer Saturdays. Ethan invited a handful of people, neighbors who had become friends, a teacher from Mason's school who had brought over soup during the early months, a cousin who had sent a cardboard box of Grace's notebooks, each one full of lists and half-started recipes. They drew a circle of blankets beneath a willow, and the wind moved through the leaves as if listening. There was no sermon, no ritual borrowed from strangers. They brought what they had, a thermos of chamomile tea, the lemon cake from the first rain night, a small tin in which the torn photograph, now glued, sat wrapped in tissue. Emma carried a paper boat Mason had folded earlier that morning, proud of every crease. Lily read one of Grace's recipes aloud, and they all laughed when the list included a dash of impossibility, the kind of phrase Grace favored when she meant risk. Ethan spoke last. He did not prepare words, but the ones that came were steady. He thanked the people who had stood with them and told Grace, in the utter simplicity of the moment, what she had meant. A hand on the map of their days, a stubborn compass that kept pointing home. He did not pretend the ache would vanish. Instead, he offered a promise that they would keep a place at the table, a chair that could hold memory and the possibility of new things together. When the cake was cut, Mason insisted they sing a made-up song Grace had once hummed while drying dishes. The tune was childish and wrong and perfect. Lily closed her eyes and let the melody settle across her face like sunlight. The paper boat was launched into the river and caught 3 eddies before it found a calmer current. Mason cheered as if it had crossed an ocean. Afterwards, they planted a rosemary shoot beneath the willow. Everyone took turns tamping the soil. Ethan's hands, which had once been mostly instruments of paperwork and quiet calculation, worked in the dirt until the soil for his nails was a dark memory of the day. Lily pressed a small pebble into the mound and said, softly, "For days we need to smell her." Mason, always precise in how he honored things now, wrapped a blue ribbon, the color Grace loved, around the stem. Home felt different that evening, not because grief was gone, but because it had shifted position on the furniture. It had become a companion to joy rather than the owner of the room. They ate cake for dinner and told stories, some true and some playfully exaggerated, about Grace's absent-minded genius. The time she locked herself out with a pot of steeping tea still on the stove. The way she had once tried to fold a fitted sheet into something that resembled an origami bird. Laughter and tears came with equal genuineness, each giving permission to the other. Months threaded into each other. Holidays arrived without the theatrics of past perfection, but with rituals that fit the family as it was. A shared turkey that came out a little undercooked, but was declared perfect by unanimous decree. Christmas lights hung crookedly and admired anyway. An Easter egg hunt in which the eggs were hidden in places that invited cooperation and not competition. Emma's drawings multiplied until an entire corner of the living room looked like a gallery of hopeful scribbles. Ethan sometimes found himself tracing the shapes she made and feeling the shape of a life that had widened. There were practical things still to resolve. Letters to write, forms to sign, small paper tasks that never quite seemed to disappear. But those were the kind of ordinary chores that taught endurance.
They scheduled a weekend that was Grace light and another that was Grace heavy. Some days they spoke of her as if she were only in the next room, others as if she were finally past the horizon. Both were honest modes of loving. One evening in late autumn, Lily and Ethan sat on the porch steps after Mason had been tucked in with a story about sailors who learned to be gardeners. The street lamps glowed. A stray breeze smelled of wood smoke and someone else's washing line. Emma's drawings wavered on the fridge like flags of minor triumphs. Ethan took Lily's hand without thinking, and she held it back with the unassuming gravity that had become her way. "We're not the same people we were," Ethan said. "No," Lily agreed, "but we're better at being us." He thought of Grace, of course, and of the strange economy of loss, how one thing taken could make room for others to grow in ways that had previously been impossible. He thought of evenings filled with chamomile and the soft noise of bedtime stories, of Mason's shoelace flares, of Emma's earnest captions. He did not have an answer for everything. He only had the practice of each small day and the patient assembling of ordinary things. They had learned, in a long and slow season, that belonging is not a sudden acquisition, but a labor of attention. It was made of returned phone calls and extra muffins, of naming and remembering, and letting the past coexist with a future that smelled, sometimes, of lemon and rosemary and the faint, steady sound of a child's laughter from another room. In that coexistence lived a quiet truth, that to love was not to hold forever, but to make room, always, for what had been and for what was yet to arrive. Outside the house, the city kept its indifferent orbit. Inside, a photograph on the mantel held 2 faces smiling, whole now in the way that matters. They had stitched their lives together, not to avoid the seam, but to honor it. The house, in its small domestic miracles, was complete enough, and so they went on, making tea for 3, tending rosemary, singing silly songs, and keeping a chair warm for memory and for what might still come through the door.